Well, hello and welcome back. I'm Adam Backstetter from the University of Kentucky, and welcome you back to the last of our current topics in TBI webinar series. So we started this, David Lone and Josh Morganti and myself, back April 6, 2020, and now after 92 seminars and over 500 people registered, we're finally at our last seminar that we have scheduled. So some of those previous seminars we have posted, and we'll keep posted, the ones that are allowing us to, on the current topics in TBI webinar series. So we'll have those out there for you in the future. And we'd like to thank the National Neurotrauma Society for their support for this seminar series. And remember, next week is the meeting. There's still time probably to register if you want to attend, and I'm looking forward to that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Casper. Dr. Casper is a historian of medicine and professor of history of science at Clarkson University. He did his BS in neuroscience and biochemistry at the University of Minnesota, and then did a PhD in history of medicine from the University College London. And his scholarship is focused on the history of mind and brain sciences. And he's published in a large number of books and articles on the history of medicine. And he's has a focus, at least one of his focuses, is on concussion and CTE. And he recently published what I think is an important paper in the field entitled "The Punch-Drunk Boxer and the Battered Wife, Gender and Brain Injury and Research." And if you haven't read this paper, I highly recommend that you look it up and read it. And he's also currently working on a monograph on the cultural history of medicine, focused on the history of violence and brain damage. And I'm looking forward to reading this also when it comes out. I know Dr. Casper's a very active on Twitter, so if you follow him, I'm sure you'll see and keep that, see when that gets posted and that monograph comes out. So thank you so much for agreeing to speak today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Adam. What a pleasure it is to be here today. It's actually a great honor also to round out the current topics in TBI series, which I've been following hit or miss on YouTube, but I've been very interested and very excited by the series. I trust that all of you know that the observation that bodily or head impact trauma is associated with neuromolecular degeneration is now almost a century old as a scientific and clinical observation. And my lecture today is not therefore going to be a history of what doctors and scientists observed alone, but it's also going to be a story very specifically focused on what normal people knew about these facts and what they talked about where that fact was concerned. So my argument today is that the way these facts were talked about produced specifically uncertainty about the disease in culture, even as responsible authorities recognized fairly well that the risks of that impact trauma could result in neurodegenerative disease. Now, I'd like to mention just really quickly that this paper is forthcoming in ISIS, which is a journal in the history of science. And so this is a schematic version of a much fuller length work that should be out in press eventually. And I'd also like to just say very quickly that I'm using sources in this talk today from Britain and the United States. And I have to, for the purposes of time, blur them together a little bit. And I understand that there's some pretty big distinctions between the cultures of class in Britain and the United States. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm a trained medical historian. And I need to disclose to you that I'm retained also as an expert witness by plaintiffs in pending concussion litigation as an expert in the history of medicine. It was 1978. Dean Martin was hosting a roast of American for footballer Joe Namath. And about an hour into his very lively and humorous roast of the great football star, a figure named O.J. Simpleton, pictured here, walked out to the podium. Simpleton is obviously a pun on O.J. Simpson. Wearing a football helmet and pads, twitching and shaking and saying to many laughs as he removes his helmet that he personally had taken all of the injuries necessary so the great Namath could shine on the gridiron, Simpleton looked out at the audience and said, "I've had the same concussion for 15 years." He twitched his eyes, he crossed, and then he joked, my speech is slurred, dizzy spells, I can't walk straight. So that was 1978. And in 1978, as you're going to learn in this lecture today, that was a fairly familiar joke. But I think actually this was one of the very last times it was made. I have not succeeded in finding the joke made sense. Writing a few years later in the pages of the Journal of the American Medical Association, George Lundberg pondered violence in American football. And he asked, could there be, quote, a substantial prevalence of chronic brain damage in American football players? The question, he says, leads one to think, one senses, quote, that football enthusiasts, including the sports medicine establishment, may not want to know. And I'm going to emphasize that may not want to know, because that's going to be a theme that will echo throughout this presentation. Now, in December of 2019, Senator Christopher Murphy of Connecticut observed that 16,000 American college football players who'd played from 1956 to 2008 likely suffer from chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This appeared in a publication that he wrote called Madness, Inc., How College Sports Can Leave Athletes Broken and Abandoned. He was drawing on a actuary report that had come out in a class action lawsuit called the Arrington lawsuit against the NCAA. So the question in this talk that I would like to ask all of you to think about is, how did we get here? How did it happen that we normalized head impacts in our culture to the point where we could know on one level their dangers clinically and nevertheless suspend our disbelief about them? And the answer I'm going to argue in this talk is that the work culture has played has had a very special role in the shaping of this disease. So to understand how we got here is going to require us to think about how people talked about this disease and how they wrote about it and how they envisioned it. To write a history like this requires bringing together a lot of different stories together, from the history of medicine, from the history of disease, from the history of neuroscience, but also from the history of sport and the history of violence and the history of modern culture. And so it's what I'm trying to do here is draw together a whole number of different threads in order to convey the full magnitude of the story. CTE, as it's known today, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is, I think, the condition most people, if you ask them on the street in 2020, might think about, if they think about it at all, when they consider the pathologies of hits to the head. But I'd like to be clear here that I think my interests, and probably the interests of this particular community, are less on this condition specifically and more on the constellation of neurodegenerative diseases that have been historically associated with bodily and head impact trauma. So I'm interested in CTE in the sense that I'm interested in the way a broader culture has forced us, or at least made us, think about accepting and even glamorizing impacts that result in brain damage. But I want to just emphasize that CTE is only one dimension of this story, as I'm sure you know. Authors in the past have repeatedly pointed to trauma as a potential cause of different neurodegenerative diseases. Here we see, for example, Andrew Wood's seminal article in 1911 querying the question of whether trauma could be an initiating factor in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And again, that publication sort of echoes throughout the last century in many publications. You see here a 2007 article querying the same question. Similarly, for Parkinson's and Parkinsonianism, we find publications from the 1930s on that have queried the question of whether head impact can be a risk factor in initiating Parkinsonianism or Parkinson's disease. The dementias, of course, are very well known to us, but I think it's worth saying that the question about whether it is Alzheimer's or Lewy body or chronic traumatic encephalopathy or whatever tended to be collapsed back in the 19th century into just the notion that these were forms of dementia, as you see here with an 1892 publication by William Julius Mickle, which initiates one of the very first discussions I've identified on the relationship between head impact and subsequent dementia-like conditions. CTE, as it came to be called now, was called punch drunk by clinicians in the 1920s and 1930s. And many of its symptoms manifested in clinical presentations as other neurodegenerative diseases, or so what was made clear in Martlin's article towards its end. And its clinical presentation, for this reason, invited quite a bit of diagnostic uncertainty from the 1920s onwards. So this has been part of the sort of story of the discovery of CTE. It's been trying to look at the way in which the conditions manifest and how they manifest differently. Now, it's the fact that punch drunk was called punch drunk that informs my discussion today. This is what I'm actually interested in. Why was it called punch drunk? When Harrison Martland, who's pictured here, published his famous 1928 study under that title, he described himself as having been something of an anthropologist and bringing the term from the ring into his forensic analysis. Martlin's interest in that study, if you've read it, was in evidence that single hits to the head could produce what he termed small petechial. This was the sort of state-of-the-art term at the time, or seed-like hemorrhages in the brain as an acute injury. And he was interested in the sequelae of those hemorrhages after the fact. And he argued in his classic paper that the recurrence of such pathologies led to Parkinsonian conditions with dementia and personality changes and other symptoms as a potential result. So it's important to just note that the study that he was looking at was specifically chronicling and inferring from single head impacts the more general condition. Now, from here, I could tell you a very interesting genealogy of Martlin's work, and I could take us through very different areas of experimental work. And we could look at, for example, biomechanics, or we could look at EEG research, and I could metabolism. We could talk about the concussion cascade. There's a lot of different research disciplines and clinical specialties that have looked at and tried to understand and conceptualize traumatic brain injury, both clinically and also in terms of the mechanistic processes that underlie the conditions. But instead, we could also look at historical context. These are the very familiar ones. So we could right look at where did these injuries and what was driving the research at the time. And here we might talk about the wars, we might talk about social legislation, we might talk about automotive safety or concussion in sports as examples. But instead, I really want to go in a very different direction here. And I want to talk to you about what Martland specifically was hearing, and look very specifically at how terms like punch drunk, slug nut, goofy, punchy, and other terms that were everyday speech euphemisms in the 20th century spoke to a kind of decline, and not necessarily decline that had to be neurological. And I'm speaking here at the level of lay people and lay culture. So the sources that I'm drawing on today to tell you this story are magazines, they're newspapers, they're places where you get sort of more intimate portraits of how people spoke in the past. Here you see, for example, a quotation from the Works Progress Administration, which was a New Deal project in the United States during the 1930s. And one of the projects had people who were folklorists going out and interviewing people just about their lives and about the world. And here we see a down and out newspaper man named Rodney talking about slap happy and punch drunk and slug nutty guys who had worked in another New Deal project called the Civilian Conservation Corps. You also see Rodney here talking about Hemingway, who has books on punch drunks and slug nuts also. And so we begin to get a sense, right, of what we might describe as a disease made first in observational languages. So languages that were slurs, unflattering innuendo, shameful insults. And my question in this paper is, does this impact the way in which disease emerges and is understood by scientists and doctors as they study it over and across many generations? And what I want to suggest to you is that when Martland peered down his metaphoric microscope and met the high threshold for what Charles Rosenberg and Janet Golden, both medical historians, have termed biological specificity for the making of this disease, he inadvertently became part of a process by which chronic traumatic encephalopathy resisted its own opportunity to escape into medicalization. Instead, what happens is, by calling it punch drunk, by labeling his article this way, he slips his research on neuromolecular degeneration into cultural ambiguity and linguistic indifference. And so it remains there in the title of its first name itself as a sort of monument to humor, slur, and innuendo, rather than a provocation to the public to be aware about the dangers of normalizing brain injuries. So Marlin then was just simply trying to endeavor to convince his readers that cases of punch-drunk boxers pointed towards the dangers of recurrent head injuries. But the result of his paper and the way it made splashy news and came out into the public's eye was that Marlin had made a contribution to a very popular sport and to understanding of a very popular sport, boxing. The result was that the sporting arena became the topic on which everyone was focused. And therefore, right, the questions became, was sport voluntary? Was it heroic? Was it worth the benefits? Were the benefits worth the risks? Marlin had not intended, I think, to enter into this discussion of sport and freedom, but that was nevertheless the discussion that came about. And for many boxers in particular, after 1928, the threat implied by being described as punch-drunk was a threat towards a loss of work and income. So to tell this story, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be highly schematic and just touch on a few choice examples to illustrate the way language shapes the background here observationally, and then track at the same time for you growing awareness among patients and families of patients, showing the difficulties that doctors had in navigating a culture where it was becoming fairly clear medically that recurrent head trauma was a problem, and simultaneously this fact was emerging in a culture that was resistant to the very idea. There were at least 5 ways normal people spoke about punch drunkenness or other languages of the ring. The first way was simply to mean a hit that was so hard it rendered the individual intoxicated or drunk. Now, such a definition appeared in a linguistic dictionary that appeared in 1933. So just a groggy or dizzy or dazed state was one way this term was used by normal people. A second usage was used to describe a down and out character with chronic problems, just chronic problems in general. So in Steinbeck's In Dubious Battle, a story about violent labor strife in California, Steinbeck puts in the mouth of his protagonist, Jim, a story about how Jim decided to join the party in the labor movement. Why did you want to join? Jim's asking. He says, quote, well, I could give you a lot of reasons. Mainly it's this. My whole family has been ruined by the system. My old man, my father, was slugged so much in labor trouble that he went punch drunk. He got an idea that he'd like to dynamite a slaughterhouse where he used to work. Well, he caught a charge of buckshot in the chest from a riot gun. And later on in Steinbeck's writing, Jim meets Joy, and Joy's a foot soldier for the labor movement. And Steinbeck again develops Joy's character in a similar way as he develops Jim's father. He describes Joy as slugnutty, and quote, he's been hit too much. And when he leads a charge at the very end of the novel against a riot police, he's described by Steinbeck as jerky, that is having a noticeable movement disorder that shapes his sort of overall movement. And he's killed in this particular tragic scene. So you can see the quote here a little bit, getting a sense of the way in which the movement disorder is represented artistically. A third way people used these languages was to speak of a person, a diagnostic figure, as a kind of metaphor for one's own trouble. So again, here we have from the Folklore Project of the Works Progress Administration, an interviewer capturing an interviewee who had worked his life as an old cowpunch. And this is a passage from about 1941. And J.M. Brown says, the trouble about it all is that I've gotten through so much misery lately that it's hard for me to think about anything but my aches and pains. I hurt all over all the time. I'm just like a punch-drunk prize fighter. I get hurt in the business and I'll never get over it. And here's another example, though it's a lot harder to follow, but sort of fascinating, from the Chicago Postal Workers. I was taken during the work's progress administration. And here we see a worker commenting on another worker's infirmities. And again, the point about this example of everyday normal speech is that we should not, as readers, view it diagnostically. These are not people who are diagnosing in each other neurodegenerative diseases. Instead, what we're seeing here are patterns of colloquial speech that showcase the way in which boxing jargon particularly was shaping normal conversations among the working classes. Such languages could be used autobiographically. Malcolm X, for example, describes in his autobiography shameful experiences of being beaten in his early youth as a youthful boxer by a white kid. And he tries very hard to recover from these losses by fighting more, and each time subsequently gets knocked out in the ring. And he observes in his autobiography that he was grateful that he'd given up his career because he feared that otherwise he would have become, quote, a punchy. Now, a fourth way that the terms could be used as a source of humoral dismissal or joke was that they hinted at some kind of deeper slur. That is, a person had an unreasonable or dazed view of reality. So, for example, you see the headline over here is Hitler Punch Drunk. Or in the case of this cartoonist Abner Dean featured in Life magazine, Dean's described as being punch drunk, but not from blows to the head, but punch drunk from words because people use too many words. Now, the final way people spoke about these languages was as a form of libel. And this one's very interesting because courts in the United States and Britain from the 1930s to the 1950s on occasion considered whether allegations that a boxer was a punchy or a slugnut or a punch drunk as a potential denigratory slur. And the reason for this was that it be described this way impacted one's ability to drive income. The very act of being described as a punch drunk meant that people would probably know how to bet on you. You'd be thought to have a glass jaw and get knocked out more easily and things like that. Even the suggestion that an individual could be found at what were described as reputable boxing gymnasiums who was punch drunk could be considered potentially libelous. And here we see a language from one particular court case, Stillman versus Paramount Pictures, which speaks very specifically to that kind of claim. So when we're sort of thinking about the overall picture of the way chronic traumatic encephalopathy and diseases of neurodegeneration from impact emerge, one potential specter here for people that sort of drives how cautiously or incautiously they speak about this is fear of libel action. Now, with the exception of the first definition, the intoxicated or dazed blow, what should be seen here is that all of these usages in everyday speech call attention to an absent person, an absent figure, the broken boxer or broken fighter who's largely vanished. In a very significant sense, the boxer was a loser in every way in American culture once the boxer became punch drunk. Not a champion, but forgotten, broken, and the type of figure who would then show up later in sort of televised film portrayals that were sympathetic towards the plight of retired boxers, as in, for example, the television film Requiem for a Heavyweight, which was turned into a Hollywood movie in the 1950s. The point is that such references were shameful. A figure who was described as a punch drunk was worthy of mockery. To be called a punchy or a punch drunk or slap happy or goofy or slugnutty was to be described as a loser in a potentially libelous way. And when boxing income was at stake, especially, comedian Red Skelton, pictured here, had a whole routine built around mocking such figures. He called himself the Cauliflower McPug in the 1950s. And the point that I'm making, right, is that routines like Red Skelton's shaped the way doctors were also describing the condition and thinking about the condition. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that doctors were also describing the condition as punch drunk as a medical one. So you have, on one hand, these cultural representations, and then on the other hand, you have these scientific and clinical representations. And by the 1950s, the culture was very specifically trying to make CTE something that should be hidden away and denied. Now, what's fascinating about that observation is that, of course, simultaneously, as we know, there was growing evidence of awareness among neurologists about the condition within medicine. And there was also growing awareness amongst two other communities. One was among journalists, and then the other were among patients and family members who thought of themselves as affected. Marlin's 1928 publication produced a lot of publicity, and he went on to become something of a celebrity pathologist, fairly unlikely, actually, for a forensic examiner. And he became famous for studies of radiation poisoning, in addition to his article on punch drunkenness. After Marlin published his study, Punch Drunk, there was a string of medical publications in the 1930s and 1940s. Punch Drunk first was called Traumatic Encephalopathy in 1934. Then it was called Dementia Pugilistica in 1937. And by 1940, chronic traumatic encephalopathy entered the lexicon, and that was the usage that began to be most common by the 1950s. Journalism throughout this period reported on various issues having to do with punch-drunk boxers and football players. Images of punch-drunk brains even sometimes appeared, as they did here in Look magazine in 1939. You'll notice up at the left hand, we see whole brain tissues. Now, such exposés were muckraking about sports, so we should be clear about that. These were ways of engaging in public condemnation, particularly of boxing, but also sporting violence, and that really materialized around conversations about whether boxing at an amateur level should be banned in Britain and in the United States. And those debates really took off in the 1950s and 1960s. While such cases are of course, interesting, there was also journalistic, a fact about the journalistic satire, which is that it was hinting at problems very specifically, like real ailments in the body. And that innuendo also appeared, for example, on the sport of football. And so, for example, the author Frank Scully, pictured here, and we should note later on in his career, a noted expert on flying saucers, was moved to write about these issues having to do with the missing football players in 1937 in the magazine of Liberty Magazine. So, by the way, I pictured and bought Liberty Magazine on eBay, and a lot of these magazines are available out there on eBay. It's been one of the joys of my historical research when finding these materials. Now, Scully described stumblebacks and punch drunks and chronic psychotics, all as part of the demographic backdrop to the great players from his days as a student at Columbia University, and whom had, he said, vanished. He joked that probably some of them had become coaches under the theory that they were industrial casualties. So in that sense, Scully used humor and innuendo and viciousness in the same way that, for example, Red Skelton used it in his character Cauliflower McPug. But underneath that sort of satiric set of observations, he also offered some novel theories about why stumblebacks were becoming more obvious and more present in everyday life. And he suggested that because the medical profession had become better at curing tuberculosis, fewer people were dying from tuberculosis. And that meant that the survival of individuals who had these diseases had been extended. And so they were becoming visible in a way that they had not been. The student newspaper at Columbia University was not impressed with Scully's satire in Liberty Magazine, but did note that he'd found evidence of many former heroes of the gridiron, quote, clicking their heels. And they treated the claim that punch drunks became football coaches rather more seriously than might be anticipated. And when we sort of evaluate that remark, we should be very careful, because we should recognize that, especially in the boxing literature, it's very clear that one of the careers open to a boxer once they'd sort of washed out because they were punch drunk, so that they could become sparring partners or athletic trainers in boxing gymnasiums. So it's not, the innuendo here is not completely far-fetched. Now, Scully's satire matched everyday family lives as well. And one man interviewed during the WPA folklore project observed that his brother Gray Eagle, which I want to be clear is almost certainly an alias, that he'd been an All-American footballer who turned pro and then eventually came to seem a little punch drunk, as the Mr. Dunkirk put it in the interview, from all the awful drubbings that he'd taken in football. So what's important about observations like these is that they hint at a growing apprehension among families about an underlying medical reality. And underlying the evidence of these early awakenings is one source that really stands out to me as unique, which appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1955 and was what I would describe as the first patient account of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Now, other accounts of being punch drunk or worrying about it had appeared, but what was remarkable about the Post's essay was that it was different in the way it was fully dedicated to exploring the illness very specifically. The author, pictured here, Harry Blutman, observed that he didn't think Red Skelton's comedy routine was funny at all, and he detailed his career and his decline and observed that many individuals he'd known had suffered far worse than he had. He actually didn't think that his state was getting particularly worse in the way that some others had who he described as becoming permanently hospitalized in asylums, which is just a point it's worth sort of parenthetically making here, that a lot of these individuals probably would have ended up in state hospitals, and the records from state hospitals are super spotty in the 50s and 60s, so it's hard to give sort of like clear patient accounts about patients who've shown up with histories of recurrent brain injury. Now, what's interesting about Blutman's account is that it has a stirring, provocative sameness with many later accounts, like I assume many of you may have even read, that sort of work to depict the suffering of these individuals who suffer from these impact-related dementias and neurodegenerative diseases. In this sense, I would say that I think Blutman's account, in some respects, kicked off a genre. So how are these ideas, these cultural and folk notions, imported into medicine? And this question is important because in a significant sense, medicine was here, right, a subculture, and the accents of these working cultures that I'm describing were actually the dominant ones, right? So there's this clear tension between what doctors know and what lay people know. And I think that that's a familiar tension to us all the way to the present. Now, doctors certainly offered advice. Augustus Thorndike, a professor at Harvard University and a doctor in sports medicine, recommended in 1952 in the New England Journal of Medicine that 3 concussions was probably the limit of exposure reasonable in contact sports. This advice we know was followed because, for example, James R. Gay described following it in the pages of the State Medical Journal that also appeared in 1958. So there was sort of high knowledge flows outwards to peripheral centers in this way. But having admitted that, we also have to acknowledge that there were doctors and scientists who were just completely oppositional to the whole notion of punch drunkenness as a real medical entity within certain quarters of medicine. So, for example, in a 1941 review of Ernst Jockel's The Medical Aspects of Boxing, a reviewer in The Lancet noted that there was no evidence of punch drunkenness that couldn't be put in a larger context. And, you know, the language here is very important to see, right? Those boxers were, quote, defectives to begin with. Defective here is a turn of phrase that actually conjures a eugenic past. And some were poor, and others were chopping blocks, which made them go on fighting long after they should have stopped. Industry doctors in Britain and the United States began to appear in the 1950s, who also tried to do more extensive research, pushing back and indeed challenging the notion that boxers deteriorated with recurrent head impact exposure. In the United States, Harry A. Kaplan, who's pictured here, was one individual who worked very hard to try to show that the conditions of professional boxers overall was basically fighting fit and totally healthy. In Britain, there were others who challenged the gravity of chronic traumatic encephalopathy as a problem, and they published frequently in places like the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, which were read worldwide. One was Joseph Louis Blonstein, who, like Kaplan, who I just described in the United States, often advised amateur and professional boxing organizations as well. Blonstein had been a boxer himself, and we might, I think, pause here and reflect on the way then that the cultural meaning of punch drunkenness as a denigration attached to losers might have selectively impacted him because he would have understood, right, the sort of metaphorical and cultural connotations of describing somebody this way. Still, other industry doctors pointed out widespread sort of hypocrisy on the issue of picking purely on boxing. And here, for example, J.W. Graham observed that heading a soccer ball was as dangerous as many other sports. And this argument was basically suggested that anything that entailed intermittent trauma to the head could cause these injuries overall. So in this final section of my lecture today, I want to just mention that there were actually attempts to translate across these divisions between sort of the lay cultures of sport, and cultures of medicine. And so in this instance, I want to actually go from a more recent example to a past example. The first is 1966 and the second is 1963. So we're only split here by 3 years, but nevertheless, normally I would proceed in chronological order, but I think this is useful and illustrative to proceed from medicine to sport, and then from sport to medicine, and then medicine to sport. In 1966, the American Medical Association sponsored its 8th conference on medical aspects of sports. And one of the papers that appeared was called The Uses of the Vernacular in the Classification of Sports Injuries, which was appeared by Kenneth S. Clark. And it was spoke specifically to the problem that these sporting languages could end up being unclear about the individual under contemplation. Now, to make this point, Clark pointed towards competing vernacular definitions for quite serious injuries. So this is an illustration in his 1966 article. And he noted that for some, for example, getting your bell rung meant a momentary confusion, whereas for others, it could indicate prolonged unconsciousness. And he basically argues that these differences in vernacular have to be smoothed out in order to create commonality. Clark observed that it was necessary to treat terminology as a substrate for communication. He says, quote, "It matters little what one person names an injury, but for the advancement of athletic medicine, those experiences need to be aligned, quote, with the experiences of other sufferers." He's just saying we need some uniformity here. The result of this was the standard nomenclature for athletic injuries. I'm holding it right here in my hand. And as you can see, one term included there was the term punch drunk, which in the standard nomenclature came to be called chronic brain syndrome, or and if you sort of track this through, this is ultimately what becomes the 2015 DSM description of traumatic brain injury from minor or major neurocognitive disorder. We can, however, and so I'm flipping now to the 1963 source, we can, however, show that people sought to formalize the vernacular also. So Clark and the committee's efforts in 1966 had been aimed at educating clinicians about these issues of language in sports. But James V. Cerny, a somewhat eccentric athletic injuries and encyclopedia of causes and effects, aimed for a completely different audience. Cerny was a chiropractor from Dayton, Ohio, and he published a number of athletic training manuals and self-help texts. This book, he said, was unapologetically not scientific. It was an encyclopedia that was intended as a work manual. Quote, "Its terminology is often that of the training room. Terms like belly pounders and stitch in the side are descriptive words straight from the jargon of high school and college athletes." And he explained further that he'd written the book, quote, "in non-technical language because he had only, quote, the athlete and the layperson in mind." So the previous work, doctors educating doctors about how this translation needs to take place. Here, Cerny is very specifically doctors trying to indicate to lay people how these nomenclatures should work. Among the odd things that Cerny tried to make observable and understandable to his audience and his readers was that there were these different severity scales from which he termed, for example, a punch-drunk concussion. Now, a close reading of Cerny's efforts here suggests that he was indicating that chronic effects from recurrent injuries and recurrent blows rather than acute effects from single or few blows were what was concerning. And he stated provocatively in one section of his encyclopedia that punch drunkenness could certainly occur in any sport. So I'm coming to the end now of my talk, and I've argued here that the discovery of impact-related neurodegenerative diseases resisted medicalization broadly because lay languages that gave rise to it also coded the disease in caricature, libel, denigration, and insult. So these rough origins that I've been talking about, I would argue, stood firmly against the dissemination of medical knowledge into the wider population. So when people were watching football, they weren't thinking about CTE in, say, the 1960s or 1970s. And in reverse, also, it made acceptance of the disease's reality for some doctors as just self-evidently an opening to invite controversy. So doctors themselves sometimes were reluctant to use these terms because they were specifically aware of the way the language was used in those cultural spaces. It was a stigmatizing language and the language of slur and innuendo. So at the same time, growing awareness from the 1940s on among families, some journalists, doctors, shows that the different kind of reality was emerging about individuals exposed to repeated blunt force trauma. So it's not that no one knew, it's just that very, very few people had sort of adopted the medical view that the doctors were publishing in the literature. And what I've been seeking to answer in this talk is at least a partial answer to the question of how could we know, medically speaking, from before 1928 for so long about these conditions and simultaneously face so late an emergence in our cultures and societies in terms of lay understanding and lay views. And so we return to George Lemberg's essay in the Journal of the American Medical Association. I think we should probably take seriously his answer that he suspected responsible authorities simply didn't, quote, want to know. And I think the languages of violence and rough and vernacular culture I've described here literally contributed to not wanting to know. The observation I'm making here has had a great deal of constancy across cultures. So for example, Rachel Taylor, a brain injury advocate whose father passed away from dementia after an illustrious career as a professional soccer player, tweeted out this primary source from 1966, which asked if an activity like heading produced punchies. And the author of this piece asks rhetorically, couldn't club doctors get together and find out? By the way, I also bought this on eBay. It's remarkable the types of materials that you can find out sort of for sale that people have been keeping in their briefcases. Now, obviously, the question about soccer was raised and repeated frequently, as, for example, 1980 B&J paper. And we know, I suspect you all know, that in 2019, Stewart and colleagues published in the New England Journal of Medicine a retrospective study indicating that soccer players had a risk of dementia 4 times that of normal population. It's worth saying that in the case of soccer, right, the sporting authorities had obviously gotten the message by approximately the 1980s, 1984. So we have, right, this longer history in the picture with many sports, not simply American football and American boxing. The stigma of losing and being a loser, though, was probably the most significant impediment to the uptake of the information that was before doctors and sporting authorities. But I would also argue that humor was too, that humor perhaps above all was the way culturally we normalized these harms and ourselves avoided wanting to know. And I often think here about my 5-year-old son, who laughs every single time he sees a cartoon character getting hit on the head. It's just one of the ways we become sort of inured to seeing these things. What we can say is that sports organizations and doctors recognize these problems for a long time. Lay people, fans of sports, fans of humor, but rarely fond of losers, on the other hand, appear really not to have connected the dots in any sort of meaningful, general social way from the slang to the medical reality. So to end here, then, I want us to return to the problem outlined by Senator Chris Murphy, which he puts as 16,000 former college football players is a very big number, and suggests to me primarily that in terms of impact-related neuromolecular degeneration, we need to shift our discussion not away from the science of medicine, which should certainly continue, but more towards a conversation about what public policy is necessary globally in contact sports and domestic violence and other settings where recurrent impact trauma is a reality, so that we can give meaningful assistance to individuals and families. Meanwhile, I think the statistic here also calls for us all to confront the ethical implications of continuing to claim that much remains to be known. Remember, right, that one of the ways that this whole story has worked from 1928 till now is actually our actively seeking and desiring not to know. I hope to have persuaded you here that we did know, we can know, and we should act accordingly. With that, I look forward to your questions, and I thank you very much for your attention. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge these individuals who read drafts of the forthcoming paper. They were absolute stars, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much for a beautiful talk. I really enjoyed that a lot. We already have a couple questions here, so I can start with those. And then I can fill in. I have a bunch of questions of my own. So Carolyn Schmidt, first question. You somewhat answered this, but is there historic evidence from other sports, such as hockey, soccer, or rugby, or lacrosse, that also have high levels of concussion and TBI, but are not considered contact sports, that you would see similar kind of histories or stories in the?
Yes, I mean, I tried to give some evidence of this, but I mean, I actually think when J.W. Graham says anything that causes intermittent trauma to the head can cause CTE, he's exactly right. So what I mean, I think the answer to the question is that we would expect to see. We don't know what the dose would be, and presumably that would vary across individuals and different populations. But we would expect to see anywhere that head banging occurs, some percentage of individuals who start to develop pathognomonic lesions and neuropsychological sequelae. But you know, these are going to be rare individuals. I'm very interested in prison populations. I'm interested in corrections officers. I'm interested in intimate partner violence. Presumably, there are groups of people who well exceed the number of what we might describe as sort of normal threshold concussions, which has to be some kind of proxy for recurrent head impacts. So it'd be interesting, right, to sort of track down individuals with like extreme head impact histories who were not in collision sports. But yeah, we certainly have you know, cases that are now being published. I think recently in the last year, there have been cases published for Australian rules football. I think that there are maybe 10 cases now for NHL hockey. I'd have to check that number, so don't quote me on it. We have lots of football players for American football. Soccer, I described some of the details. The first case that came to autopsy, it was called industrial disease, was Dawn Assel in her Jeff Assel, Dawn Assel's daughter. She's an advocate in the United Kingdom. That was 2002 that autopsy was done, and I think described by the coroner as evidence of industrial disease. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is that I don't think we've done actually a really great job of identifying all of the various groups who have high levels of these exposures. And so that's you know, a piece that I think needs to be thought about. I have weird evidence from history that suggests coal miners had a lot of exposure to head impacts sort of right around the late 19th century, and also people who worked with horses. We know that jockeys have been found with these neuromolecular diseases, but I sort of suspect that there was a whole group of people back before cars who worked with horses who, if we could identify the right primary sources, would at least hint at these things. It would be very difficult to do any kind of retrospective diagnosis. It's a great question.
Do you think, kind of bridging off of that, do you think that kind of the term, so you had the punch drunk and punchy, you know, that was very related to boxing, but none of the other, was there any kind of terms like that kind of came with any of the other sports, or did you ever come across anything like that?
So no, this is a really great question. Doctors refer to these, I think, as traumatic dementias. I'm almost 100% certain about this. If you read dictionary and encyclopedia definitions in the 19th century, traumatic dementia tends to be the way they describe about it. But boxing it's so hard to understand this from our vantage point in 2021, but boxing from like the 1890s on has been an enormously popular and global sport.
Mhm.
And it was so popular. One of the reasons for this is it was one of the very first sports that could be filmed and then subsequently travel around and shown to people. And if you think about it, the nature of the ring is such that you could put two cameras on two sides and then splice the film together in reels. And then you could sort of travel to boxing halls. And if there wasn't an actual fight, you could show them reels of old fights that people could watch. So a lot of people were interested and excited by boxing, and at the time of World War I, boxing was really sort of represented by all of the armed forces worldwide. I mean, both Axis and Allies armed forces, as a way of toughening up and creating courage and various things in the fighting men. He's so many mobilized men that really creates in the interwar period this massive culture of boxing that just sort of shapes language in a way that I think you don't see in American in football until maybe like the 1960s and 1970s, for example. So there's a paper coming out in Frontiers. I forget right now the author's name. Townsend, I think. It looks very specifically at Australian sports in this regard, and again down under, they're finding a similar way in which boxing shapes an explicit vernacular in this way. I think stumblebums and stumblebacks comes out of a very specific type of slur about poverty. So you find that term sort of always attached to an idea of the ghetto or an idea of poverty, and that's earlier, maybe 1910s, 1920s, sort of progressive era. So that doesn't seem to be aligned to the sports language, but they come together. So the stumble bum, the stumble back, and the punchy and the goofy all sort of they get lined up in this way. It's a great question, though. I mean, just to be clear to everybody, it's actually extremely hard to reconstruct these working class languages. And that's one of the inherent challenges with this kind of historical work. But boxing makes it unusually clear. I suspect there probably were other slangs that did this. I just haven't identified them.
Interesting, thanks. So the next question is by Ramesh Ragapathy. First he said, wonderful talk. And then he asked, could you comment on the blaming of the victim that even in the Martland indulged in his 1928 paper, saying that boxers were poor, of poor talent, and coming from low social economic status. And this seems to be a common thread throughout the 1950s and later. And does this extend to the domestic violence and the prisoners as well?
Absolutely, it's essential, and I think one of the jobs I would extol basically all scientists and doctors to acquire for themselves who work in this space is to see, right, that when you talk about these issues, it requires what is called in social medicine structural competency. You have to identify the stigma. You have to talk about the stigma. You have to name the stigma, because until, right, it's very easy to blame the victim here. It's very easy to query, right, pre-morbid characteristics. It's very easy to do. I mean, basically, it's easy to discredit somebody if you wanted to discredit them. That's very simple. But what you see when you look at this history is that there is a recurrent, and I would extend this, by the way, this comment to all of TBI. Okay, there's a recurrent theme of endeavoring to stigmatize the victim and make the victim in some way blameworthy for these things. Now, this works in really strange ways. I have a paper coming out in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics that tries to talk about this very clearly, but I'll just kind of allude to this. Okay, so one of the ways it works, right, is that people would say that the reason you knew somebody was malingering or faking their injuries was because sports players got concussions all the time and they were just fine. So that meant, right, that somebody had fallen off a ladder during household work was faking their injury. But now when you create, right, in public consciousness an idea that you should behave a certain way if you have head impact trauma, the football players or the rugby players or whoever it is, they grow up in this culture. And so they're aware, right, that stoicism is valued. And so, right, you create a stigma through the martial culture, the Spartan culture of these contact collision sports that shapes how people who report, anecdotally report, or sometimes, right, we have population studies that show this, that they have sequelae that follow from their symptoms. And then people say, well, that's probably because there's something wrong with them individually. And then people hear that and they're like, well, I don't want to be identified as somebody who gold bricks or somebody who malingers or simulates. So I'm going to just cover up my symptoms. So it's a really complex environment here where stigma can flow both from culture into sports and from sports into culture, and then they shape both of these conversations. I think the only way we can deal with it is to name it. And I mean, I'm not saying, right, also, I mean, we have to be clear here. It is completely conceivable that people could be producing fake symptoms. It's completely conceivable that people could be externally motivated. But I think, we have like a century worth of evidence here that also suggests that, especially within the matter of subjective symptoms, there may be good reasons for first just listening to the person and making sure that we're not engaging in stigma. And I think that's pretty crucial. So I really appreciate the question. I'm really grateful for it. And you're right, Martland does it too. Although I will say, just in sort of defense of Martland, I think he, because he's arguing for taking even single hits to the head seriously, and he's a part of a culture in that point among forensic examiners who are trying very hard to figure out what's happening in single episodes of concussion. I think what he's trying to say to you when you read that paper is, look, getting hit in the head is a bad idea. And so in that sense, he's sort of a defensive position, and that's the way I read him for the person who has very limited head impact exposure, but who still struggles.
So how do you think, you sort of went up to about the 80s or 90s, how do you think we're doing today in the changing our language around TBI? Do you think it's...
No, I think we're doing a very bad job. In fact, I think in many respects, our overall communication strategy has almost completely failed because there's so many stakeholders in this conversation. So my general position would be to say to everybody, what we should try to do is be maximally transparent about what we think these risks are, why we think that these risks are worrying, and let other people after that decide. But right now, my view is that in 2020, a lot of the sort of prevailing folk attitudes that I've described still out there. And in fact, I mean, I think we have, we have an industry, several industries, in fact, that are huge stakeholders in keeping us from wanting to know. And so from my perspective, that's extremely worrying. I think, I do not for a moment believe that our collision sports are ever going to go away. I would certainly never actually even argue that a historian had the business of having a viewpoint on that. Sports are very much a part of our identities and parts of our cultures. But I think it's unequivocal that we could make many of these sports substantially safer without getting rid of the sort of spirited play of the game. And I think beyond that, it's unequivocal that we should just be extremely clear with people about what these hazards are so that they can make good decisions for themselves, but also so that in the case of like high schoolers, young college students, for example, their parents can participate in those conversations and make sure that they're also being clear. Because, we have this sort of arbitrary line between adults and children. But I know as a college professor, our students rely on us, and at least in American universities, to be clear and honest with them and to try to give them a clear perspective. I don't think we're doing that. And I think I think people need to be much more upfront. I'd like to see, frankly, really large posters in locker rooms across America on these issues. I don't think there'd be any harm in it. And I think people would at that point be much closer to informed about the issues, but we're just not there.
Well, we have a number of additional questions, but we're at the hour, so I think we'll have to stop and move on. But thanks so much for sharing your wonderful talk with us, and just like to also thank everyone who participated today and throughout the whole series as we shut this thing down and finish with the history of TBI, and now this seminar series is also history. So
can I just say, Adam, that I would invite all of the people who have questions to go ahead and just write to me, and also if anyone would like copies of the sources I presented, I'm happy to share those with you. It's absolutely fine, and so just write to me at Clarkson University, and I'll certainly answer the questions. Okay.
great, thank you very much, and take care, everyone. Bye.